The year is 33 AD. Rome wakes beneath a rising sun, yet the marketplace greets the morning with an unfamiliar silence. The usual chorus of merchants calling out prices is muted. There are no crowds pressing between stalls, no clatter of coin pouches, no rustle of contracts changing hands. Under Emperor Tiberius, a truth older than the empire itself has finally surfaced. The debts have grown too large to be paid. In the shaded porticos where scribes hunch over wax tablets, numbers are etched and re-etched. Columns of figures are added again and again, debts weighed against assets, estates measured against obligations. No matter how the accounts are arranged, every calculation leads to the same conclusion. The sums do not bend, the totals do not yield, the debt will not return. Behind the stone walls of the Senate, Rome's wealthiest families argue in low, strained voices. The patrician class, men who for decades financed plebeians, merchants, provincial governors, even one another, are now frightened by their own ledgers. Their apparent wealth is built on the assumption that loans will be repaid with interest, but mortgages are in arrears. Land finds no buyers. Interest accumulates on parchment, yet no silver changes hands. Each senator knows that if one great house falls, the entire structure of credit may collapse with it. Beneath marble monuments and triumphal arches, the empire is being hollowed out by one simple fact: too many people owe more than they can ever repay. This is what a debt crisis looks like when it finally comes into the open. It does not begin with fire in the streets. It begins with silence in the markets, hesitation in the counting houses, and a quiet recognition among those who can read numbers that the story is over. In 33 AD, Rome reaches that moment. The solution will not be honorable repayment, but a crude reset. Imperial funds injected to keep the system from imploding, followed by the debasement of the currency. Creditors will be sacrificed. Savers will be diluted. The game will be extended, but the underlying arithmetic will not change. Across the next 2,000 years, other societies will arrive at the same dead end. In medieval Europe, Italian banking dynasties will stretch credit across a continent until the figures in their ledgers dwarf the real wealth of the societies they serve. In revolutionary France, a monarchy drowning in obligations will turn to paper money backed by seized land and watch that paper spiral into worthlessness. In Weimar Germany, a defeated nation will print banknotes by the trillion to service impossible reparations. In post-war Europe, creditor nations will meet in London and simply erase half of Germany's obligations with the stroke of a pen, conceding openly what earlier eras tried to hide. Past a certain point, debt is not repaid. It is removed. Over and over, systems of credit have swollen beyond the capacity of the underlying economies. Leaders insist that obligations will be honored. Accountants and mathematicians quietly point to the numbers and say they cannot be. In the end, the numbers win. Debts are destroyed through hyperinflation, through plague and war, through revolutionary currency experiments, or through negotiated jubilees. Each reset erases savings and transfers wealth on a scale that ordinary politics never achieves. Today, the pattern is repeating on a global scale. In 2025, total world debt has climbed to roughly 335% of global GDP. Against about $90 trillion of annual economic output stands over $300 trillion in accumulated obligations, claims on future production that must somehow be honored with interest. And financial sector borrowing, plus vast unfunded promises in pension and entitlement systems. The details differ by country, but the aggregate picture is stark. The world has promised far more than its economies can realistically generate. Debt is, at its core, a contract about the future, a promise that tomorrow's production will be sufficient not only to sustain life and maintain infrastructure, but also to pay interest on everything borrowed yesterday. As long as growth outruns obligations, the structure can hold. Once total debt climbs far beyond total annual output, and once the interest on that debt absorbs most of each year's new production, the system crosses an invisible line. New borrowing no longer funds real progress. It simply services old promises and rolls over loans that can never be repaid in real terms. History shows that when total debt in a society pushes toward 250% of GDP and beyond, growth begins to suffocate. Resources that might have renewed infrastructure or funded innovation are instead routed to interest payments. Credit becomes both the engine and the weight of the economy. Beyond that point, the path is disturbingly consistent. First easy credit that feels like prosperity, then extreme leverage, then interest silently consuming growth, then recognition, conflict over who takes the loss, and finally a reset through inflation, through a sweeping jubilee, or through destruction so vast that the old contracts simply stop mattering. Rome walked this path. So did the kingdoms of medieval Europe, the Bourbon monarchy in France, the Weimar Republic, and post-war Europe's creditor coalition. Each trusted that some combination of growth, austerity, and financial engineering would reconcile the books. Each discovered, in the end, that when the math and the promises diverge, the math wins. We are now well into the same six-stage sequence on a global scale. The age of easy credit is behind us. The world has already crossed the critical debt threshold. Interest is beginning to devour growth. The remaining stages, recognition, political fracture, and reset, are no longer theoretical. They are the logical consequences of the structure that has been built. This is not prophecy. It is pattern recognition. What follows is a walk through the last 5 resets to see how this pattern unfolded before, and to understand what it means for every unit of currency you hold, every debt you owe, and every asset you currently think you own. Before we trace those collapses in detail, one idea must be understood clearly because it sits at the center of every reset. When debt climbs beyond what an economy can support, the society does not tighten its belt and slowly pay the balance down. It never has. It never will. At a certain scale, repayment is not a moral question or a political question. It is a mathematical one. And the mathematics, once crossed, demands something far more radical than reform. It demands erasure. Throughout history, the tool used for this erasure has taken different forms, but in substance, it is the same. A debt jubilee. In ancient civilizations, the term could be literal, a periodic cancellation of obligations decreed by a ruler, wiping clean the ledgers of the poor to restore social stability. In the modern world, the form is often disguised, hyperinflation that quietly vaporizes the real value of what is owed, negotiated write-downs dressed as restructuring, or war and catastrophe so large that entire books of claims are abandoned because there is no longer a functioning system to enforce them. At its core, a debt jubilee is the partial or total cancellation of debts across an economy. Not a targeted bailout, not a small policy tweak, but a systemic reset. It is not an act of generosity. It is what societies do when the alternative is collapse. A student taking on a $100,000 loan is implicitly claiming that, over time, their skills and labor will produce enough value to repay that principal plus interest. A government issuing bonds is pledging the future tax base of an entire nation. For a single person, the line is obvious. At some point, a salary cannot cover both basic living costs and an exploding burden of interest. For a nation, the line is harder to see because it is buried in aggregate data and abstractions. But the principle is the same. That growth, around $2.7 trillion each year, is the new real value created. Now, set that against a global debt load of $300 trillion. If the average interest rate on that debt is just 3%, then the system demands roughly $9 trillion in interest payments every year. That shortfall must be covered by more borrowing, more money creation, or more creative accounting. Each year that the pattern persists, the imbalance deepens. At that point, there are only three ways out. The first is hyperinflation, or its slower cousin, sustained high inflation. The government and central bank create new money in such quantity that the real value of outstanding debts shrinks rapidly. Nominally, contracts are honored. Creditors receive the number of units they were promised, but those units buy much less. The system avoids explicit default by destroying the purchasing power of the currency itself. Savers are wiped out. Bonds become traps. The illusion of repayment is maintained while the substance is hollowed out. The second method is a more open jubilee. Authorities explicitly declare that certain debts will not be paid in full. Principal is written down. Interest is forgiven. Timelines are extended so far that the present value of the claims collapses. Sometimes this is framed as restructuring. Creditors absorb visible losses. Debtors are freed. The financial architecture is shattered and must be rebuilt. The third method is war and catastrophic destruction. Here, it is not policy that cancels debt, but reality. If cities are bombed, factories reduced to rubble, and governments overthrown, then the promissory notes issued by those governments and businesses become meaningless. Creditors may exist on paper, but they no longer have the means to collect. Debtors may technically owe, but there is no functioning court, no stable currency, no intact bureaucracy to enforce payment. In this scenario, debt dies alongside infrastructure and human life. Every major debt crisis in history has ended through one or a combination of these three paths. There is no fourth option where debt far beyond productive capacity is painlessly worked off over time. That narrative of disciplined repayment, shared sacrifice, and gradual normalization is politically attractive, but mathematically false once a certain threshold is passed. When global interest obligations dwarf real new output, or when a state's entire revenue is consumed by servicing past promises, the direction of travel is already set. What remains to be decided is how the erasure will happen, not whether it will. This is where the six-stage pattern begins to matter. The end game, hyperinflation, jubilee, or destruction, is only the last chapter. Long before that, there is a familiar build-up, a sequence that has repeated with unsettling precision across empires and eras. It starts quietly, with something that feels like prosperity. First comes a phase of credit expansion. Loans become easier to obtain. Interest rates are low. New financial instruments emerge. Governments borrow to fund wars, social programs, and infrastructure. Corporations borrow to buy back their own stock and to pursue acquisitions. All of this activity shows up as growth. Statistics improve. Politicians point to rising output and employment as evidence that their policies are working. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. The apparent prosperity is being financed. Instead of emerging from organic increases in productivity, it is pulled forward from the future. The society is not richer, it is more leveraged. Future income has already been claimed, spent in advance, and scattered across balance sheets as assets. In ancient Rome, in the decades after Augustus, this looked like patrician families lending aggressively to one another and to the broader population, financing spectacles, public works, and private luxury on an unprecedented scale. In medieval Europe, it took the form of Italian banking houses extending credit to kings, nobles, and merchants, underwriting wars and trade routes with money that did not yet exist. In the post-war West, it was the vast expansion of consumer credit, mortgages, and government guarantees that turned a generation of soldiers into homeowners and students into highly leveraged participants in a newly financialized economy. On the surface, these periods are remembered as golden ages. Roads and aqueducts, cathedrals and universities, highways and suburbs bloom into existence. Incomes rise, consumption explodes. But running through all of it is the same thread. Credit is expanding faster than real, sustainable production. The illusion is pleasant, but it is still an illusion. As the cycle advances, debt piles higher. The total stock of obligations, public and private combined, creeps toward a critical multiple of the underlying economy, RES annual output. Economists today estimate that when total debt climbs past roughly 250% of GDP, growth begins to slow. The weight of servicing old promises starts to drag on the ability to create new wealth. More and more of each year's effort goes not to building the future, but to honoring the past. At that moment, the system has quietly crossed into a different regime. The story told to the public remains the same, that with prudent management and enough time, the debts will be paid. But the numbers are now moving according to a different logic, a logic that has ended in the same destination 5 times in 2,000 years. And it is within that logic, the 6 stages from exuberant borrowing to final erasure, that our current global position must be understood. Stage 1 of the pattern always feels like a triumph. It begins with the loosening of credit and the sensation, almost physical, that the future has opened up. In Rome between 10 and 30 AD, this phase unfolded beneath marble and marble's reflection. With the empire stabilized under Augustus and then Tiberius, wealth pooled in the city like water in a basin. Patrician elites, secure in their political power, discovered a new way to expand their influence: lending. At first, it seemed harmless, even virtuous. Loans financed trade caravans, merchant fleets, and construction. Senators funded aqueducts whose arches still impressed the modern eye. Forums rose from the dust. Roads cut through mountains and forests, binding the empire together. The money for these projects did not appear from nowhere. It was created as credit, promises written by hand and sealed with wax. As those promises multiplied, Rome looked richer than it had ever been. But much of what was built in that age did not generate productive capacity. Gladiatorial games, public feasts, and vast personal estates consumed resources without creating new streams of income. Governors borrowed to buy office, then borrowed more to pay the bribes that kept them in favor. Wealthy families borrowed to outshine one another in generosity, sponsoring spectacles that lit the night sky while their ledgers darkened. The empire's skyline improved, its public entertainments grew more extravagant, and its social hierarchy hardened around a new axis: who owed whom. On the street, it felt like prosperity. Workers were employed. Stonecutters, sailors, artisans, and laborers found work on endless projects. Markets bustled with imported luxuries. No one outside a narrow circle of moneylenders and scribes could see that the prosperity was not being generated. It was being pulled forward from the future. Rome was consuming tomorrow's production today and recording the difference as debt. Centuries later, medieval Europe would repeat this first stage with its own symbols and institutions. From their counting houses in Florence, the Bardi and Peruzzi families created an invisible web of obligations that stretched from Italian city-states to the courts of England and France. Kings who once relied on slow, unreliable tax collection discovered that they could summon armies with the stroke of a quill. A campaign could be financed now and paid for later, with interest. The 100 Years' War, one of the continent's most destructive conflicts, was lubricated by this very mechanism. The apparent prosperity returned. Trade routes flourished underwritten by letters of credit. Cathedrals rose across Europe, stone pushed upward toward the heavens by money borrowed on earth. Universities emerged, funded by patrons whose wealth often existed as entries in the books of Italian banks rather than coins in a chest. The age remembered as one of cultural flowering and expanding commerce was, behind the scenes, an age of leverage. Again, the pattern is clear. Loans did not merely finance productive investments. They financed wars, prestige projects, and the lifestyles of elites who assumed that their future subjects would somehow generate the revenue needed to square the accounts. Banking families extended credit to monarchs whose annual incomes were dwarfed by the sums they borrowed. The theater of power expanded. The numbers in the ledgers expanded faster. Revolutionary France entered the same stage with the glitter of Versailles and the illusion of inexhaustible grandeur. After Louis XIV's wars, the state was already heavily indebted. Yet instead of retrenchment, borrowing accelerated. Paris became the intellectual and cultural capital of Europe, its salons and palaces fueled not just by current wealth, but by future taxes not yet collected. The arithmetic, as always, remained out of sight. The appearance of strength and the reality of obligation moved in opposite directions. In the 20th century, Weimar Germany initiated its own version of Stage 1 under the weight of defeat. Crushed by reparations denominated in gold marks, the new republic confronted obligations that exceeded its capacity almost from the beginning. Yet instead of defaulting outright, the government borrowed domestically and abroad. Reconstruction, social programs, and reparations were all financed with money that did not yet exist, channeled through the banking system and increasingly through the central bank itself. For ordinary Germans, the early Weimar years did not feel like collapse. The immediate post-war chaos gave way to what looked like stabilization. Factories resumed production. Unemployment fell. Cities rebuilt. The illusion of normalcy returned, underpinned by a rising tide of paper claims on the future. The deeper truth that Germany had promised to pay more in real value than its economy could reasonably deliver remained buried in policy documents and balance sheets. The post-World War II West refined this stage into an art form. In the United States, the GI Bill opened the doors of home ownership, education, and entrepreneurship to millions. Mortgages, student loans, and business credit transformed a generation. In Europe, Marshall Plan aid and domestic credit programs rebuilt shattered economies at unprecedented speed. High growth rates and youthful demographics made the borrowing seem not just safe, but wise. For 3 decades after the war, it was easy to believe that this time was different. Productivity rose, wages climbed, and living standards improved across large parts of the population. Governments, corporations, and households all took on more debt, confident that tomorrow's incomes would be higher than today's. The pattern, credit expansion masked as permanent prosperity, played out on a global scale. Yet, in each of these cases, the apparent boom contained the same flaw. The stock of debt was growing faster than the stock of real, productive assets and the income they generated. The theater sets were elaborate, the lighting perfect, the performances compelling, but backstage, stagehands were quietly stacking promises one on top of another, building a tower whose foundation did not expand with it. At some point in every cycle, the structure passes from impressive to unstable. In Rome, medieval Europe, revolutionary France, Weimar Germany, and the post-war West, there came a moment when total debt, public and private, rose beyond a critical multiple of the economy's yearly output. The exact numbers varied, but the logic did not. Once debt climbed into the realm of 2.5 times annual production and beyond, growth began to choke. The shift is subtle at first. Economic expansion slows. Investment in genuinely productive ventures is quietly crowded out by the need to service interest on existing obligations. Governments devote more of their budgets to paying bondholders and less to maintaining infrastructure or building new capacity. Corporations allocate profits to debt service and financial engineering instead of research and development. Households find an increasing share of their incomes absorbed by mortgages, student loans, and consumer credit. From the outside, it may still look like progress. New skyscrapers rise, fueled by borrowed money. Stock markets hit record highs, buoyed by cheap credit. Governments roll over old debts at slightly higher interest rates, reassuring the public that the situation is under control. But in the underlying math, a limit has been crossed. The system is no longer using debt as a tool for growth. It is using growth, whatever remains of it, as fuel to keep old debts alive. By the early 2010s, the modern global economy had unmistakably entered this second stage. The financial crisis of 2008 should have been a signal to deleverage, to reduce the tower of obligations. Instead, central banks cut rates to the floor, governments launched stimulus programs, and the private sector resumed borrowing. Global debt, which had hovered around 200% of GDP before the crisis, surged past 250% in the years that followed. By the time a global pandemic struck in 2020, total debt had already climbed into the low 300s as a percentage of world output. Emergency measures pushed it higher still. At these levels, the pattern that once seemed like an academic exercise in economic history becomes something else, a map of our current position. The first stage, the credit-fueled illusion of prosperity, is behind us. The second stage, where the burden of debt reaches a level that begins to stifle genuine growth, has already been completed. What lies ahead are the more violent phases of the cycle, the point where interest payments begin to consume all new production, where the impossibility of repayment becomes visible, where politics fractures under the strain of deciding who will bear the loss, and where, finally, the debts are erased by one of the three brutal tools history has preserved: Ancient Rome reached this point in 33 AD. Creditors, anxious about mounting risks, began calling in loans. Debtors, already stretched, could not pay. The supply of new credit dried up. Land prices collapsed as buyers vanished. Without the ability to borrow, few could afford large estates. Wealthy families, who had once appeared unshakable, discovered that their fortunes were built on sand. They owed more than their assets could realistically cover, and with credit frozen, there was no way to extend the illusion. Interest claims on existing debts were consuming the empire's surplus, channeling wealth from those who worked and traded to those who held paper claims. The economy did not stop outright, but it lost its forward momentum. Medieval Europe experienced a similar seizure. By the mid-14th century, Edward III of England owed debts to the Bardi and Peruzzi banks were so large that even full royal revenues could not satisfy them within any reasonable horizon. When the king stopped paying, the banking houses collapsed, and with them the network of credit they had supported across Europe. Merchants who relied on Italian letters of credit found themselves stranded. Trade slowed. The remaining debts did not vanish, but the flow of new money required to keep them serviceable did. Interest weighed on diminished revenues, leaving little room for expansion. On the eve of the French Revolution, the Bourbon monarchy found itself in an almost pure version of Stage 3. By 1788, more than half of all French state revenue went to servicing the debt. Versailles still glittered, balls were still held, but behind the walls, the arithmetic was unmistakable. The kingdom was borrowing simply to pay interest on previous borrowing. Any serious attempt to honor the debt in full would have required either crushing new taxes or the dismantling of the very system that sustained the monarchy. Power. Neither option was politically acceptable. In Weimar Germany, the dynamic was even more brutal. Reparations denominated in gold marks sat on top of domestic debts and the costs of reconstruction. Government revenues could not satisfy all of these claims. The state resorted to the printing press, issuing ever larger quantities of paper marks to meet its nominal obligations. At first, inflation rose slowly, then it accelerated and the structure lurched toward Stage 4. As prices climbed, the real value of tax revenues eroded even as the nominal sums ballooned. The more the state tried to pay, the less meaningful its payments became. Worldwide, interest on the mountain of public and private debt began to consume a growing share of new income. In the United States, federal interest payments approached $1 trillion per year, rivaling or surpassing entire major spending categories. With total debt, public, household, corporate, and financial, far in excess of annual output, even modest interest rates implied immense transfers from the productive economy to creditors. In real terms, genuine growth was weak. Once an economy reaches this state, the political rhetoric may remain optimistic, but the internal logic is fixed. Even aggressive austerity cannot close the gap because cutting spending also cuts income, shrinking the tax base and damaging the very growth needed to escape. What follows is Stage 4. Recognition. Stage 4 is not an official announcement. There is no single speech or report in which a government admits that the debt will never be repaid in full. Instead, recognition seeps in through the actions of those who understand the numbers. Creditors shorten the maturities of the loans they are willing to offer. They demand higher interest rates. They seek collateral in more tangible forms: land, infrastructure, natural resources. Rating agencies issue downgrades. Central banks begin to hint, then say outright, that without their intervention, the system would not be stable. In ancient Rome, this recognition crystallized when it became clear that many of the most prestigious families were, in fact, insolvent. Patricians who had lent aggressively to others had, in turn, borrowed heavily themselves. When their debtors failed, so did they. The Senate's attempt to force stability by requiring creditors to hold a large portion of their wealth in Italian land only highlighted the problem. If those orders could not be obeyed without triggering mass liquidation, they were confession in legislative form. The numbers did not work. Researchers, analysts, and even official institutions began publishing charts showing total debt towering over GDP and interest obligations crowding out other uses of income. Governments that had once promised balanced budgets shifted, without admission, to managing perpetual deficits. The story changed from "we will pay it all back" to "we will stabilize the ratio," and then to a quieter acceptance that even stabilization might be out of reach. At this point, the abstract question of debt sustainability becomes a concrete political conflict. Debtors, households, businesses, and states push for relief. Creditors demand protection. The social contract, already strained, begins to tear along class, generational, and sectoral lines. Popular representatives pressed for broad cancellation of debts. The elite resisted, knowing that such a move would annihilate much of their wealth. Labor became scarce, giving surviving workers new bargaining power. In effect, the pandemic performed a grim jubilee, wiping out not just people, but the web of obligations that bound them. In France, the conflict between debtors and creditors erupted into open revolution. Creditors who had expected to be repaid in full found themselves paid, if at all, in rapidly depreciating revolutionary paper or in confiscated assets sold at distressed prices. In Weimar Germany, the political turmoil of the early 1920s gave rise to movements explicitly promising to reject reparations and overturn the existing order. Extremist parties grew by channeling the anger of those who felt crushed by obligations they had never personally agreed to. On the other side, savers, pension funds, and institutions that hold vast portfolios of bonds protest that they relied on the promises embedded in those instruments. Inflation, they argue, is theft. Default is betrayal. Each policy proposal becomes a proxy battle over which group will absorb the hit. Stage 6 is where the argument ends, not because consensus is reached, but because events overtake debate. The reset arrives through one of the three mechanisms history has preserved. Hyperinflation can, in a matter of months, vaporize the real value of outstanding debts. A formal jubilee can, in a matter of signatures, rewrite the terms of entire classes of contracts. War or systemic collapse can, in a few brutal years, render previous obligations irrelevant. In Rome, a partial jubilee came when Emperor Tiberius released vast sums from the imperial treasury as interest-free loans, giving debtors the means to satisfy their creditors and stabilizing the system temporarily. For individuals living through such a transition, the grand sweep of history is less important than the basic mechanics of survival. When a debt-based system approaches its reset, the distinction that matters most is simple. Are you primarily a creditor, or are you primarily a holder of real assets? Debtors with fixed-rate obligations, by contrast, often emerged strengthened. They repaid what they owed in devalued money, or saw their obligations written down or wiped away entirely. Those who held hard assets watched currencies and governments change around them, while the underlying utility of their property remained. The global system has not yet reached its final stage in this cycle, but the pattern, credit expansion, excessive leverage, interest-consuming growth, recognition, political conflict, and eventual reset has already advanced far enough that its broad direction is visible. What remains is the portion of the story that every generation believes it can rewrite, and that history, again and again, quietly concludes on its own terms.